Welcome back to Daf Yomi Be'in, in which we'd like to take a closer look at something from the week's Daf Yomi. And in this video, we would like to examine the Gemara on Friday's Daf. That's on Daf Kuf Ches, starts there Kuf Ches and Aleph. And on that page, the Mishnah presents perhaps what we could say is the most classic kind of Basar B'chalav situation of a forbidden mixture, of where a drop of milk falls into a pot of meat. Now, the Mishnah specifically discusses where a drop of milk fell on an individual piece. So it's not like he mixed it all up together with the other pieces in the pot. So the Mishnah rules that if there is not enough meat, if that one piece is not large enough that it's 60 times the drop of milk, then all the Mishnah says is asur. It's asur, it's not kosher. The Mishnah doesn't directly discuss, are we talking about only that piece or all of the contents of the pot? So Rav comes along and discusses this point, and Rav actually says that everything in the pot is not kosher here. And Rav explains the reason. Rav tells us that here's the way it works. First step is that, again, assuming that we don't have enough meat in the one piece to nullify the milk. So what happens, obviously the piece is practically is not kosher, but it's more than just that we have something that, fundamentally is kosher, but it has some non-kosher floating around in there. Rather, the halacha says that this piece is nasis nevela. You look at it like it became, pork. It became a nevela, totally not kosher. It's viewed in halacha now as all of the meat, all the cotton, not just that drop of milk, wherever that's floating around, but the entire volume of the piece is now prohibited. The next step is that we say, Rav, at least, is of the opinion, he agrees with the Tanur of Yehuda, that even if you have much more of the other pieces, 60 times more than this one prohibited piece, we can't say that the prohibited piece is nullified, because it's min b'mino. It's the same type of thing. They're both meat. It's meat and meat. So nullification doesn't happen here. So the end result is that everything in the pot is not kosher. So says Rav. So in this video, we want to take a closer look, think about this concept of chaticha nasis nevela. What exactly is this idea that the piece turns into, it's considered that you'll convert it into nevela? How does it work? What are its guidelines? So I wanted to share with you an opinion of the Ravid that is brought by different Rishonim, including the Rajab and Taras Abayis. It's Shar Ravi, or Bayis Ravi, I should say, Shar Aleph. And he there brings the Ravid who makes the following distinction. The Ravid says that we only say this idea that says, okay, now the meat is, the whole piece is considered not kosher, if you're dealing with something like meat, where you have something solid and there's a prohibited flavor that's now inside of that piece, it's balua in there. So then the halacha says the whole thing is prohibited. Again, we're not going to try to understand right now exactly what that means, but Ravid says, if, however, you had a situation of just liquid, you had liquid, kosher, let's say wine, and a little bit of non-kosher wine, we wouldn't say this. We wouldn't say that the only way to nullify the contents would be to get 60 times of the entire amount. Ravid says, no, that's not how it works. We don't say this concept in such a case. Now, many Rishonim ask on the Ravid that our Gemara on Amid Beis appears to contradict this distinction of the Ravid. When you turn the page, on Amud Beis, the Gemara says the following. The Gemara discusses a situation where, the opposite, you have a big pot of milk and a piece of meat falls in there. So the Gemara deals with the question of, the halacha is that the piece of meat is obviously not kosher. It has absorbed milk flavor, but the milk is fine. So the Gemara asks, according to Rav, why is it fine? It should be a problem. Let's analyze what's happening here. We have some milk that inevitably gets into the meat. Let's look at that milk. That milk absorbed some of the fleishiks. It got that meat flavor in it. So that milk, the milk that went into the meat, presumably became basar b'chalav. And according to Rav, the way that works is, it's not just, we don't isolate just the prohibited tam. No, we say, okay, that thing, whatever entity became not kosher, like the whole entity now is considered not kosher. So now when it mixes with everything else, with the other milk in the pot, we should now apply the idea of min b'mino. It's milk and milk. And so everything should be not kosher. So the Gemara seems to be saying that even by liquids, it's pretty explicit actually. The Gemara is telling us that this concept that Rav says extends even to a liquid, that same idea that again, once a problematic halachic tam enters into the food in question, whether it's a solid or a liquid, we now regard that entire entity as a prohibited thing, and we have to proceed accordingly in terms of the rules a bit of how much permitted element would you need to nullify that. We would have to proceed on that basis. So it seems to contradict the Ravid. The Rashba there in terms of bias gives an answer for the Ravid, which is very interesting. Brings out the unique nature of basar b'chalav. He says that when the Ravid told us this idea that everything, the whole piece becomes prohibited, but not by liquid, the Ravid was only saying this distinction by other prohibitions, not by basar b'chalav. The Ravid would agree, however, that as far as basar b'chalav, since it's such a unique prohibition in that the Torah is saying basar is fine, chalav is fine, it's just that when they get together we have a problem. So once the Torah said this unusual concept that when they're joined together it becomes an entity that's not kosher, and the Ravid agrees that certainly that happens in the sense of, as soon as that meat flavor went into that little bit of milk, that's an entity called basar b'chalav, and certainly we now have to proceed on that basis. If that now enters the other milk, we have a problem. If you hold that same type of things we don't do nullification, then we're going to be stuck. We have a problem. Everything is not kosher. That is the Rashba's defense for the Ravid. So I just had first an observation, and then I'd like to suggest a possible understanding for the Ravid's distinction. The observation I'd like to make of the Rashba's answer is that really this is not a new argument. This point that basar b'chalav is different because the Torah is saying that even though these two foods on their own are fine, but when they're cooked together, then it all of a sudden becomes something prohibited, is something that the Gemara just above suggested. And that was the discussion between Abaye and Rava. And Rava said that, this is true, that the halacha basar b'chalav is unique. We can't assume that because the Torah says something by basar b'chalav that applies elsewhere. But Abaye was saying no. Abaye said that no, we don't consider basar b'chalav as something unique, and we would therefore apply anything that the Torah says at basar b'chalav. We could apply that elsewhere. So it's interesting that it seems to me that the Ravid's or the Rashba's defense for the Ravid only works according to Rava, which Tosfos actually says that Rava's response is not the that's not the accepted position. It was just a push-off answer, but it seems that the Rashba is making a defense for the Rashba on the basis of Rava's position. So that's observation. And now, as far as the theory itself, the Ravid's distinction that he is making here. So how do we understand this? Why should it make a difference? What does he mean that it's only when you have a prohibited tam that goes into a solid that the Torah says we look at the piece as a piece of nevela? So I'd like to suggest that maybe the idea is like this. That, how does this really make sense? Logically, we would say, why should that be? If the forbidden tam went into a piece, but now the forbidden tam is not in that piece, why should that piece still have a status of not kosher? What's the idea? So apparently, the Rav is teaching us that it's kind of like an imprint. This piece had prohibition in it, so that event, brands it as prohibited. As soon as a non-kosher tam enters a piece, then that's branded as that's a non-kosher piece. That conversion happens. So I think we can start to understand that that's only if there's an identifiable entity here that we could point to and say, okay, this piece absorbed not kosher, so it's not kosher. As opposed to if it's just a bunch of liquids mixing around, there's no particular entity that we could point to and say, this had absorbed and not kosher, so now it's not kosher. No, it only makes sense when you have a mixture of liquids that, okay, let's judge how much not kosher is there, how much kosher is there. Is there enough to nullify? We proceed on that basis. And I think that this is the way I understand, at least, the words of the Shach, who brings our Gemara, who explains the opinion of the Ravid. It's in Tzadi Beis Sif Dalid. He's on the Ramah there. And the Shach is, I believe, is Sif Katan Yudalid. He uses words. He says that it's only if there's something chashiv. So this is the way I understand what he means by that. You have a piece, and Isser went into a piece, a chashiv thing, then that could become prohibited. Now, in case you're feeling, how is this practical at all? It's a nice discussion, but does it impact the halacha? Well, the answer in this case is yes, that because in fact the Ramah I mentioned a moment ago says this exact distinction. He brings the Ravid, he brings this leniency of the Ravid. Again, the Ravid who is saying that if it's liquid and liquid, we don't say that the whole thing is prohibited, and therefore we need much more to nullify it. No, we can just judge the prohibited portion itself. So the Ramah says that if it's a really pressing situation, there's a big financial loss at stake, then perhaps we could rely on the Ravid, but he says for sure not in the case of Basar B'chalav. Why? Because of this distinction of the Rashba and Tarsa bias, that Basar B'chalav is a different animal. Basar B'chalav, there for sure, the Ravid never meant that we would make any distinction, that we would limit Rav's concept by liquids. That no, if you have milk that absorbed a tam of basar, that's it. The whole thing is permanently branded basar b'chalav. We would have to proceed on that basis. So it actually impacts the practical halacha. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.